Alhamdulillah, Allah has permitted for us to get together here for the 10th and final session, inshallah, in our readings or summarizations of Ad-Da' wa Dawa or Al-Jawab Al-Kafi, which is Ibn Al-Qayyim rahimahullah's book that was written in response to a desperate plea from someone that felt trapped in a life of chronic sin and addiction to un-Islamic practices and major sins. And so he began the book giving him hope, because our deen is always about hope, that Allah has never sent down a disease, even the spiritual, except that for it is a cure. And then he went on to explain at great length all that Allah Azza wa Jal opened our eyes to regarding the dangers of sins and their damaging effects in this world and the next. And then he went on to explain the different classifications of sins and how some of them are more apocalyptic, more dooming and faster in their destructive potential than others. And then he went on to spend at length what he believed, this is my reading, what he believed to be the problem of this man, that this man was trapped in love in particular with another human being. So this 10th and final session will be a segment of that book that was actually mentioned not at the end, but a little bit earlier. I'm sort of, rearranging a bit, deliberately, by design. I believe that this is a good way to review a lot of the remedies he spoke about throughout, and also another way to understand the list style of remedies for those trapped in love that we discussed last Friday. And if we had to pick a theme or a title for this discussion, it will be guarding the keys or the inlets or the gateways to the heart. So he discusses first of all that, when Allah Azza wa Jal, the same way he said, and we discussed last Friday, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا, don't come near fornication, he didn't forbid fornication. He illustrated in a way to show that it's a continuum, that you don't come near, because if you come near, you will fall in. He says, likewise, there are other places in the Quran that make this same chain link portrayal or picture in our hearts and minds, like when Allah said in Surah An-Nur, قُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَغُضُّوا مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِمْ وَيَحْفَظُوا فُرُوجَهُمْ. Tell the believing men, and the ayah after it says believing women, to lower their gaze and guard their chastity, their private parts, right? So he mentioned the first link in the chain and then the last link in the chain in terms of zina at least. And then Allah said, ذَلِكَ أَزْكَى لَهُمْ. That is the way for them to become more pure. You're not going to become pure if you don't follow the prescription. You have to follow it from the beginning in the right way. And then he ends it by saying, إِنَّ اللَّهَ خَبِيرٌ بِمَا يَصْنَعُونَ. Allah is fully acquainted with all you do. So he mentions, for the purity of the heart, lowering the gaze before protecting the private parts, but then he also includes that sense of being watchful of Allah and His perfect knowledge of all things. And then he cites yet another ayah. He says, and elsewhere in the Quran, Allah mentions His knowledge again of every glance, every blink that people take or people make. And also He ties it with the thoughts that are generated by these glances, or the thoughts that get you to glance, these ideas, these passing thoughts, these whispers or insinuations inside you. And that's him referring to the ayah where Allah says, يَعْلَمُ خَائِنَةَ الْأَعْيُنِ وَمَا تُخْفِي الصُّدُورِ. Allah knows the treachery of the eyes and what the hearts conceal. What's the treachery of the eyes? The early Muslims say when you're basically a schemer with your eyes, right? I have a sister in my family. She goes, those guys that are with a bunch of guys, but they're always stealing glances? Women know who they are. Women think those guys don't know that we notice. Good. Social responsibility is a part of it, right? It's a good crutch until we fear Allah Azza wa Jal. But this ayah is saying whether or not someone catches you, Allah knows every treachery of the eyes. The early Muslims used to say the treachery of the eye is when a person is lowering their gaze until everyone with them is not paying attention, then he steals a glance. Looks like he's not, but he is. In a treacherous way, he steals glances there and here. وَمَا تُخْفِي الصُّدُورِ, and what the hearts conceal, which is what? The thoughts and the preoccupations and the fantasizing and the dreaming and the wishing and so on and so forth. So Ibn al-Qayyim takes these two ayat and then he says, rahimahullah, this is why the spiritualists, the scholars of Tazkiyah, we just translated as spiritualists, the experts in spirituality, they often insist that safeguarding the heart is impossible without four things. That there are four things, guarding them is the only pathway to guarding your deen. And that is guarding your thoughts, and guarding your glances, and guarding your utterances, the things you say, and guarding your steps. Being critical of yourself, where are you going, where are you not going. And they say that if you falter, if you get distracted, if you get baited, if you are not on top of your game, right? If you falter in being a vigilant gatekeeper on these four, your glances, your thoughts, your, what was the third one? Your utterances and your steps, your enemy, who's your enemy? Shaitan, will bring your fortress to the ground. It's inevitable. And then he speaks about each of them at a bit of length. He says, as for the glances, they are the ambassador of desires. Some of you may notice the review element here. And he says that most evil outcomes, evil actions, they are the result of unrestrained glances. That you don't restrain your gaze. The same way that most fires occur by underestimating sparks. Most fires are by you downplaying this fire hazard, as we say nowadays. That it can cause sparks, or there are sparks and you belittle the spark. What can a spark do? Most fires are because of that. It's just the candle we forgot to put out. It's just a few extra plugs we put in the outlet, right? Most fires are from belittling sparks. In the same way exactly, most evil is from unrestrained glances. He says, and that is why the Prophet ﷺ said in the authentic hadith, Ya Ali, O Ali, radiallahu an, La tutbi' an-nadratu. Do not allow a second glance to follow the first. Don't look twice. فَإِنَّ لَكَ الْأُولَى وَلَيْسَ لَكَ الْآخِرَةِ. Because for you is the first one, meaning forgivable for you is the first one. But the second one is not. The second one is not forgivable. What does it mean, the first one? Don't tell me I haven't blinked yet or anything like that. What's the first one? The mistaken, the accidental, the inadvertent glance at anything haram, you will not be held against you. There's actually another narration in Sahih Muslim where he said, سألت النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم عن نظرة الفجاءة أو الفجأة فأمرني أن أصرف بصري. I asked the Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم about the sudden glance, the accidental glance. It's not that I know something is there and I'm looking. I didn't know something was there. My eye fell on something unintentionally. And Allah is fully aware of our intentions. And so He commanded me to just immediately divert my gaze. Just look away immediately. And in another hadith, he said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, إِيَّاكُمْ وَالْجُلُوسُ عَلَى الطُّرُقَاتِ. Beware of sitting on the roadways, on the street. Now the street is the online world, right? That's the street. We even call it the information superhighway, or we're used to, right? That is the highway, the online highway. Don't sit there. He forbid us from sitting there. They said, Ya Rasulullah, ma lana min majalisina bud. They said, Ya Rasulullah, we can't give up our gatherings. Like, we have nowhere else to sit. Maybe their homes are tight. Maybe sort of the business can't be spoken about in the masjid. Whatever it's going to be. Sometimes we're just going to have to sit here. We have no other place. So he said to them, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, if you must, not everybody must, if you must, then safeguard the rights of the road. They said, Ya Rasulullah, what are the rights of the road? When you're on the road, you owe the road something. They said, what is that? And he mentioned in some narrations 6 things. In one briefer narration, he basically summarizes it into 3 things. He said, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, غَضُّ الْبَصَرِ وَكَفُّ الْأَذَى وَرَدُّ السَّلَامِ. To lower your gaze. You're not sitting in the street just wandering. or scrolling, right? It doesn't work like this. It's not allowed. Even if you do it, it's not allowed. Tell yourself it's not allowed. I gotta stop this. So you lower your gaze. You don't just sit there and just stare at every passerby and everything that's happening, because something there was bound to be wrong, and that wouldn't be accidental. You're sitting there waiting for it to happen. And kafful adha, and restraining your harm. You're not going to be loud. You're not going to leave trash on the road. You're not going to be sitting in people's way as they're trying to pass. Kafful adha, restraining your harm. And the third one is raddu salam. You are obligated to return the salam to everyone that passes by you and gives you salam. So once again, him mentioning lower the gaze. And he says, and this is the beginning of everything, right? This is the spark. The same way that we know, far from the eye, far from the heart. This is normal. When you don't, someone's not in front of you, when a relative is not in front of you, you forget to call them sometimes for weeks and months and hopefully not years, right? It's just the way it works. But sometimes you can use it to your advantage. If you don't see it, if you put enough blocks between you and it will never stoke inside you these raging wildfires of desire for it. And then he says, the glance sketches a thought in the mind. This is the problem. Which then generates a desire in the heart, which then continues to strengthen and strengthen until it becomes an intention. If I can, I will. It becomes an intention. Then that intention becomes eventually an unwavering determination. I have to have this. No more waiting. I'm going to take initiative. I'm not going to wait for it to fall in my lap anymore. I'm going to go after it. Then it becomes an unwavering determination, and then it becomes an action that must happen. Once it's an unwavering determination, it will happen unless some external factor gets in your way. And you get no credit for that in that case. In other books, Ibn al-Qayyim, rahimahullah, if I'm not mistaken, he says, then it has to become an action, and then the punishment for an evil action is what? Falling into another one like it. And then an action follows an action, becomes a pattern, which is a habit, and a habit becomes your very personality, and then may Allah forbid, it locks you into a trajectory of doom. And he says also, very articulately, he says the wandering gaze is like towing a cliff's edge. You keep looking, it's like you're deliberately trying to be nimble on the edge of a cliff. This is not a place where you want to test your agility. This is reckless. He says, but even if you don't fall off the cliff with your gaze, you appease your eye by damaging your spiritual heart. Like, even if you were looking, will never wind up in you, for example, committing zina. There's so many other things that will happen to you, guaranteed, because of all we spoke about earlier on in the book. He says also, in addition to damaging your heart, which is the number one loss here, there is also the torture that you inflict upon yourself emotionally. Not the spiritual, the religious, but the torture of yourself emotionally, because when you look at something you cannot have, but the more you look, you feel like you can't live without, it puts you in this cycle of just grief and frustration. Frustration that you cannot have this, but at the same time you cannot stay away from it. He says, so understanding that helps you realize that you sending your gaze forward, you looking, and not being, concerned about this, is like you shooting an arrow. Your gaze is like an arrow that actually boomerangs and hits only you. And then, because you've been hit by it, you've been poisoned by this poisonous arrow, you try to remedy yourself with what? With another arrow. That's what happens. To look again and look some more. Look again and look some more. He says, identical to the case of the drunkard, the alcoholic, who tries to drink away the pain, the disorientation, the intoxication with what? Let me get another cup. Let me get another bottle. Wal-'iyadhu billah. He says that's the gaze. If you are not self-disciplined regarding your gaze, everything else is going to be harder. And that's when he moves on to number 2, and he says, as for your thoughts, guarding your thoughts, this is more difficult because they are the beginnings of good and evil. Meaning when you look, you start thinking. So when you start thinking now, the project is already underway. The wheel has already started moving. You get it? That's the problem, why it's harder, he says. And it's the thoughts are from where the intention to the determination sprout, as we said. And so whoever can be vigilant about their thoughts, whoever can turn off their thoughts, what do we call it? Self-interruption? To be able to just distract yourself from your thoughts. He says this is a person that will have a firm grasp on life's reins. Like all of a sudden you find yourself thinking about something, oh, whoa, how did it get here? If you can catch yourself at the second base, that's someone with a lot of restraint. That's an impressive person, right? They have a lot of self-regulation, as we call it, nowadays. And this is going to be the person that's able to interrupt and subdue their desires when necessary. Because you don't always have to subdue it, right? If you saw a vacation, you want to take a vacation, it's halal vacation, all right, fine. But you're going to be in control now, that I am not going to be driven by these thoughts that are just floating in my head. He says, and the opposite will bring the opposite. Whoever is dominated by their thoughts, then their desires will bring them into full surrender. Their desires are going to make them tap out. And an inevitable doom awaits the feathers swayed by their thoughts. Meaning if you accept for yourself to be that person, to become that person that is like a feather in the wind. Because you know your desires, it's beautiful in Arabic actually. The desires are your hawa. It's called hawa, right? The word for wind in Arabic is what? Hawa. That's like the air or the wind, right? Rih, hawa. And so the desires are things that are like, it's almost like an aroma, like what's cooking. If your behavior, Allah forbid in our day and age, your identity, your entire existence is defined by some temporary thought or feeling, you're finished. There's no recovering from this without Allah Azza wa Jal's favor on you, to give you a second chance, to wake you up out of this stupor. But if you are a feather in the wind, that every time a temporary passing thought comes by, it's able to settle and have the steering wheel, he says then this is an inevitable doom awaits such a person. He says because the thoughts now, if they're able to settle, they will pile on. And it's actually very scary. Because when I was translating sort of this for you, I'm imagining the Metaverse in our time. The impending Metaverse. May Allah protect us. Anyway, he says the thoughts continue to pile on and present themselves to your heart until they give you a clear image, but a false image, like a hallucination. This is gonna be so amazing, right? You know, when Allah Azza wa Jal speaks of the misguided in the Quran, one of the images he gives about them is what? كَسَرَابٍ بِقِيعَةٍ. It's like a mirage. You know a mirage? You hallucinate that you see an oasis of water in the middle of the desert. Kasarab, like a mirage, in a lowland somewhere. So you know, why are you hallucinating? Because you're desperate. You're thirsty, you're parched, you're desperate. So you begin to see what you wish was there, right? And what happens then? Obviously, if you're about to die from thirst and you think you've seen an oasis, what do? You run. So Allah says, Kasarab, like this oasis in a lowland, يَحْسَبُهُ الظَّمْآنُ مَاءً, that the thirsty person thinks is water, حَتَّى إِذَا جَاءَهُ, and then he expends his all to get to it. Once he gets to it, لَمْ يَجِدْهُ شَيْءٍ, finds it to be nothing. The ayah actually continues to say, وَوَجَدَ اللَّهَ عِنْدَهُ فَوَفَّاهُ حِسَابًا وَاللَّهُ سَرِيعُ الْحِسَابِ, and then he finds Allah in front of him and gives him his payment in full. Allah did not deceive him. He chose to deceive himself, so Allah allowed him to be certain in his belief about what he wanted to believe. This is why, you should not be surprised, and you should ask Allah to always spare you. How can someone seem so convinced? Maybe they're not, and maybe they weren't always like this until they've used up all their chances. How can someone be so staunch that they're willing to argue for 10 hours? That could actually be a sign of insecurity, by the way. Or willing to put their life on the line for their false belief. It could be a punishment from Allah Azza wa Jal, that they're hallucinating falsehood as truth at this point. Or obviously talking about this on a much lesser level, for someone who could already be a believer, inshallah, and we're trying to protect him from falling out of belief. He's saying on the sin level, not on the disbelief level, a person can imagine the sins to be something so phenomenal when they're not. He says, then he speaks to sort of people that have some self-respect. And he says, and the lowliest of souls are those who prefer to live a fantasy while knowing it's not true. Like before you get too deep, you need to tell yourself, wait a minute. Do I have no dignity? I'm going to sit there and just like imagine, play imaginary games with myself. He says, the lowliest of souls are those who prefer to live a fantasy while knowing it's not true, handing their minds over to a dream instead of getting up to do something about it. Like, just go get married, man. Go get a job and get married. Go, learn a craft and make some money. Go, develop a skill and gain the respect you wanted. Whatever it's going to be. Get up and do something. He says, and how can a dignified human being settle for a gain that is a mere figment of his imagination? The metaverse. This is like a hungry person imagining that he is savoring food and drink. Any person with self-respect and a lofty spirit gets upset when such vain things occupy his mind. If a person has regard for themselves, you get upset. You're like, how am I even thinking about this? I'm imagining sort of haram relations. I'm imagining, dessert that I'm going to drive out to for 2 hours. And even that would be sort of getting up and doing something about it, lousy as it may be. And then he goes on to give you the opposite. And he spends actually the lengthiest subset of today's talk on this. He says the sensible person should only think about what benefits them in this life and the next, or that which wards off harm in this life and the next. So there's 4 categories. He's telling you, whatever you're thinking about, it better be in one of these 4 categories. Benefits you in this world, or wards off harm in this world. Benefits you in the next world, wards off harm in the next world. That's it. He says, and if you cannot pursue all of these at once, then the sensible person should learn how to differentiate between the greater wins and the lesser losses so that they can optimize their time and optimize their efforts. He says, but this requires intelligence and it requires Islamic knowledge to know what Allah prefers more. Why did the Sahaba, say, Ya Rasulullah, what's the best deed? He'll say praying on time. Then they'll say what? What's after that? Why did they say what's after that? Are they going to skip number 1? No. Because they don't want to guess and then accidentally go to number 11. So he wants to know clearly what's number 2. In case I can't do number 1 or I've already done number 1. And so he says it's going to require intelligence, wisdom. He says it's going to require Islamic knowledge. He said, and the third thing it's going to require is experience. Because a lot of this is subjective. There are things you need to know you're not good at. Right? Like nobody's perfect. Right? But he says this what I'm telling you about, you being able to maximize what your mind is preoccupied with and differentiating between better and worse and all of that. He says this is what really separates people. He says, like for example, some people develop ultra mastery, be absolute experts in some matter in this dunya, but they know nothing about the akhirah. May Allah guide Steph Curry to Islam. But the man in dunya has refined his craft in a way that has removed him from everyone else. Right? But in the grander scheme of things, this is a rubber ball with air inside it that you're throwing into a metal ring with some fabric under it. That's what it is. Right or wrong? How does that compare with the purpose of life and the eternity of afterlife? Right? That's what he's trying to tell you. Some people have developed such a finesse, such a specialization in the gains of this world, and he doesn't even know, he knows how to think about it. He has mastered it. Or think of business. Al-Hasan al-Basri rahimahullah, when he was commenting on the ayah in Surah Al-Rum, يَعْلَمُونَ ظَاهِرًا مِنَ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. All they know is the outward nature of this world. وَهُمْ عَنِ الْآخِرَةِ هُمْ غَافِلُونَ. And they are completely unaware of the hereafter. Al-Hasan al-Basri gave an example about this ayah. He said, هُوَ الرَّجُلُ يَجْعَلُ الدِّينَارَ عَلَى ظُفْرِهِ. He's a man. I give you an example. This is like his version of the stock market expert. Okay? The man who puts a gold coin on his nail and can tell you how much it weighs. That's how good he is. Right? Like Uncle Scrooge. You guys know Uncle Scrooge? DuckTales. You guys don't know DuckTales? May Allah give you guidance. The guy, Uncle Scrooge, used to kick the chest with the gold in it and know that there was one coin missing. Well, it made him very grumpy though. But that's what Al-Hasan al-Basri is saying. He puts a coin on his nail and he tells you how much it weighs, it's missing a gram or it's extra a gram, وَلَا يُحْسِنُ يُصَلِّي. He doesn't even know how to pray. He doesn't even know what time the prayer times are. This is where people separate themselves now, right? Knowing these categories. But then also, there's something worth saying here for those that are trying to chase the highest ranks in the akhirah. Some people dedicate themselves in ways that limit them in the akhirah. You know why? Because you may not be built for certain acts of worship. You're better built for another act of worship. I mean, the Prophet ﷺ praised Abu Dharr so extensively, radiallahu anhu, one of the senior most Sahaba. And he said to him also, "O Abu Dharr, I love you, and I love for you what I love for me. Don't ever accept a position of leadership over two people. And don't accept to supervise or be responsible for the wealth of any orphans. It's not for you." He said, "Inni araka da'ifan." I see that you have a weakness. Abu Dharr was one of the strongest Sahaba, but he was weak from another angle. Weak in his discretion, the Sahaba said, the scholars said about this hadith, and so just stay away from leadership. Stay away from sort of caretaking of orphans and so on and so forth. His passion would overtake his prudence, basically. And so, Yaqeen Institute actually has a very nice paper on your spiritual personality. Like, are you more an Abu Bakr or are you more a Umar? Or are you more, I know everyone's going to say Umar, right? Okay. Are you more a Uthman or are you more a Ali, radiallahu anhu? Those are actually the 4 archetypes they put out. And then after the research, the back end of Yaqeen created a personality test for your spiritual personality. That's a part of it. There's a part of this, it doesn't have to do with personality, just Islamic knowledge. I'm just giving examples on why you need to have experience, even about yourself, subjective experience. But even Islamic knowledge, like if you want to read Quran, in your head, Quran's the best thing out there. But then a guest comes and knocks on your door. You're going to say, no, I'm not entertaining my guest, I need to read Quran. No! This is Islamic ignorance now, right? Ignorance of, because whenever there's an obligation, automatically, the obligation will supersede the voluntary act. Right now, honoring your guest is mandatory. So it will always be better in Allah's eyes than the greatest of the voluntary deeds, like reading Allah's word, subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's what he means by knowing how to think about things. So a person needs to develop discretion in this matter. He says, but obviously it goes without saying that thinking about Allah and the hereafter is the most important thing, and that comes in 5 forms. Occupying your thoughts with Allah and His Messenger come in 5 forms, he says. He says, number 1, deeply pondering on the ayat, the verses, signs, right? Allah revealed, His book. And to seek to deepen your comprehension of what He meant by those words. There's a big difference between reading and thinking you understand, reading and confirming you understood. And then reflecting on that confirmation, on that confirmed understanding. And he says elsewhere that there is no remedy. If we had to shut down all the long talking, there's no remedy for the heart like deeply pondering on Allah's words. Full stop. Nothing like it. Number 2, deeply reflecting on Allah's ayat that are observable. The signs now, he called his verses ayat, and he called the universe filled with ayat. They're signs, because they both direct you to Allah, and they are both for that end. He says, what are you supposed to be thinking about? Inferring from His universe, His names, learning about His names, and His attributes, His great attributes and qualities, and recalling how Allah dispraised, He condemned, He criticized those who thoughtlessly, mindlessly wander this earth. The ayah in Surah Yusuf, or Ra'd also, وَكَيِّن مِّنْ آيَةٍ, and how many ayats there are out there. يَمُرُّونَ عَلَيْهَا, they pass by it. وَهُمْ عَنْهَا غَافِلُونَ, they're completely oblivious, they're completely heedless. There's a treasure under your nose, and your head is elsewhere. So being mindful is sort of inseparable from being Muslim. Mindful the right way. Number 3 of the 5, he says reminiscing on His countless favors, how He's been good to you now. Not just how He points to Himself or how He's been good to you, and to infer from that how vast His mercy is, how vast His patience is, how enormous His forbearance is, how great His forgiveness must be. Subhanahu wa ta'ala. Number 4, thinking about the flaws of one's inner self. and your shortcomings in practice. Because these thoughts are so beneficial, he's saying, to the unruly, the stepping out of line tendencies within us all. The flaws in our salah, the flaws in our siyam, the flaws in the slippage of our tongues, right? The way we speak to our parents, our diligence in the zakah, any of this. To look at how defective these things could be. And they in fact are. Number 5, and the last one, he says, analyzing the duty of the hour so that your moments are neither wasted nor used suboptimally. You could have used them better, since these moments will never return. He goes on to say, actually, interestingly, you may find this interesting, every other form of thinking outside of these 5 categories, like thinking in the right way, thinking as an act of devotion, dhikr, remembering, reflecting, right? He's saying everything besides these 5 is a devilish whisper and a distraction from shaitan. He says, and there have been many people on this path, the path of spiritual refinement, the path of tazkiyah and tasawwuf, right? Many people, he says, even masters of the path, they went astray by attempting to suspend thinking. You know, some of them, they speak about, the stations of intoxication, for example, right? The stations of bewilderment, the stations of being sort of lost from thought, that I don't recognize anything, because if I recognize that I'm thinking, that means I'm still observing myself, and I'm still not yet observing who? Allah. That was sort of their philosophy behind it. That was that to recognize yourself is still a sign that you haven't yet arrived. He's saying, and they fell into this major error. You know the idea of sort of even swooning and passing out and these things. And it's a discussion on the ruling of this at a later time, yani. But the point is, he's saying they realized one thing that most of the time we're thinking about unworthy things. So they were trying to remedy that by doing what? By suspending all thought. So he said you caught one thing and then you overlooked so many other things, meaning you solved one problem by creating many more. The objective is not that the heart be void of all thought. The heart cannot be void, but rather you have to fill it with all that pleases the Lord of Might subhanahu wa ta'ala, as much as you can fill of those 5. And he even brings an example that I've heard this example maybe 15 years ago, and I've heard it many times in these last 15 years, and I'm still struggling to fully reconcile it. But it's been reported widely that Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu an, his mind was so preoccupied with righteous deeds, with virtuous thoughts, and pleasing Allah in as many ways as he could, that he would have at times arranged the armies in his head. Like, I'm going to send these there, and I got to move this leader back and put someone else in him. He was being a bit reckless last time. He's arranging the armies and the battle strategies in his head as he would perform salah. So Ibn al-Qayyim is saying, and this entails that he was performing salah and jihad at the same time. He says this is called the merger of devotions. Your devotional acts are overlapping now. And that only the genuine pursuer, someone who's really sincere, who's grounded in knowledge, which is probably why I don't understand it, who's grounded in knowledge and has endless ambitions, has a great himmah to please Allah, can ever do these things. And this is really the bounty of Allah Azza wa Jalla, that He gives it to whoever He pleases. Not randomly, of course, but those who deserve it. So He's just showing you that you want to fill your head with as much khair as possible and remove from it, not to leave it in a void, but all that would distract from that khair, all that would hinder that khair, that goodness. And he makes one final disclaimer as I close, on thoughts at least. He says, and these passing, let us say that passing thoughts are not what we're talking about. All these evil thoughts and hold on to, gatekeep your thoughts and regulate your thoughts and all of this. He says, we're not talking about passing thoughts. So that Dr. Khalid doesn't beat me up, okay? This is all halal, psychiatrist approved. Passing thoughts will not harm you, he says. Very beautifully, listen. But eliciting them, you conjuring up the thought, and entertaining them will harm you. right? Like if you sit there and you deliberately engage and, elaborate the fantasization of, whatever you're dreaming about, right? That is what is shameful and blameworthy. He said, because these thoughts are like a passerby. Imagine someone passing on the street, like a salesman passing on the street. What are you supposed to do when you see a salesman on the street? You don't make eye contact. You avoid. Because he's not going to let you go until he sells you the coffee machine. That's what's going to happen. And you don't want a coffee machine. It won't even fit. So he says he's like a passerby. So long as you don't call them over, they won't bewitch you with their deceptive claims. That's the way you treat these thoughts. Pass by, pass by. Get busy with something else. He says, as for utterances, what you utter, your words will have a humongous effect on your actions. If you are not careful of what you're in conversations about, you will find yourself slipping into actions you never thought you would perform. What are your discussions? The same way that secondhand smoke, will still destroy your lungs. Secondhand evil, discussing evil, right? Even how much we joke about, we should be very careful. And so, the Prophet ﷺ approved of humor, but within limitations, and those limitations involved being truthful, not being boisterous, not being at the expense of other things, and so on and so forth. And he said to us ﷺ that no person's faith will be correct, لا يستقيم إيمان عبد حتى يستقيم لسانه, until his tongue, no person's faith will become upright حتى يستقيم قلبه, until his heart becomes upright. And his heart will never become upright unless his tongue becomes upright. And Ibn al-Qayyim here, he talks about the fact that this is the true measure. Like he cites Yahya ibn Mu'adh rahimahullah Razi as saying, the hearts are like kettles, what you cook in. And the tongues are like the ladles. The ladle, you get the big scooper that you get the soup out with, right? The tongue is like the ladle. If you want to know for sure what's in the kettle, take a scoop, meaning the same way you taste with your tongue what's in the kettle, you will know what's in their heart from their tongue. That's what he's saying, essentially. The hearts are kettles and the tongue is the ladle. And so if you want to know someone's reality, wait till they speak. And he says, and this is true, all throughout history you find a grave contradiction in people. People that are devout in ritual, or they don't only consume halal meat, or he says this, but they have no idea that it's far worse for them to be consuming the flesh of other people with backbiting. Like someone sees themselves and the world sees them as religious. But if you backbite, that's an enormity. It's not a small thing, it's a major sin. So if you're committing this major sin every single day, then how religious are you? Are you religious? No, you're not. Like in the, in the meta-analysis, you're not religious. That's what he's saying. He's saying, and there are many men that are known for their hard work and ritual, and in their resisting huge sums of money, and being able to say no to so many temptations, but they're victims of their own tongues. And that is why he said to us, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, whomever can guarantee for me what's between their two legs and between their two jaws, that tongue of yours, I will guarantee for that person Jannah. And on the converse, he said, a person may say one word out of Allah's displeasure with them. Because of that one word, they will plummet in the fire so deeply. And he said, this is like the most difficult part, that it goes both ways. There are people that have mountains of good deeds their tongues will destroy, and there are people that are going to have mountains of evil deeds that their tongue will destroy. How? By using their tongue for khair. That's why, many of the mashayikh, when they want people to get onto the right path, they busy them with da'wah and taking care of the youth and reciting Quran and giving nasiha and learning and dhikr, because this tongue is it's so light. You could do so much good and so much damage with it. And so you busy it with the best things. He says, and there's two pitfalls to the tongue, that whoever avoids one usually doesn't avoid the other. He's saying that's why you want to pay attention. He's saying they're saying the wrong things with your tongue. Whoever can restrain themselves from saying the wrong things with their tongue, they often fall into the opposite extreme, which is what? Not saying the right things with their tongue. Sometimes you got to speak up, right? So if you say the wrong things and you're endlessly speaking, you're vulgar, you're indecent, you're a big mouth, all of that. And if you're silent when you should be speaking, then what? You're a coward, you're a traitor, you have a huge shortfall. And so being able to know when to use your tongue in the right way in both of these regards, this is a challenge that requires your undivided attention. And finally, and I already spoke about this in the khutbah today, so I don't need to address it as much, he has your steps. And as I said in the khutbah today, you can't control what your environment does to you. I use the example of friends. You can't control what your friends do to you. They will impact you 100%. So all you can control is what? Whether you set foot in those environments or not, where you go. And whenever we say where you go, you can't tell yourself, I don't go anywhere. I'm just sitting there doing nothing. You go places virtually. If you put yourself in those environments, you will not be able ever to resist the imprint. The imprint happens very gradually. Like if you are exposed to an environment that commits major sins, you will not commit major sins right away. You'll start at first belittling your minor sins. That's what's going to happen. I'm not killing nobody. I'm not committing zina. I'm not sort of missing this is how you move the goalpost, as they say. And Ibn Qudama gives an example of this. I'll use it as I close here in his book Mukhtasar Minhaj al-Qasidin. He says nobody interact with those who commit major sins except you always find them becoming complacent with minor sins till they pile up on them. He says, and I'll give you some examples even of belittling major sins, like how you get to an even later point. He says, you notice that people are far more offended. This is profound because he's writing this like 700 years ago. More. People are not offended when you miss salah anymore. But they're so offended when you miss, without an excuse, a day in Ramadan. You guys notice this, right? Like someone doesn't fast in Ramadan, it's like, A'udhu billah, like, what are you, shaitan? Like, what is it? You're not fasting? He says, why is that? Because if you think about it, missing salah is far worse than missing siyam. So why are people more offended by missing siyam? Too much exposure. Everyone misses salah. Not everyone. So many more people miss salah than miss siyam. That's why. See how that desensitization happens? That numbing effect happens? Because siyam is like someone, even that you'll find people that don't pray, be like, let me at least fast Ramadan. Like, I'm not like totally out of the loop. I'm gonna at least fast Ramadan. Like, what am I? Kafir? It's just like, what? So I'll fast. But salah is like a year-round commitment, day in and day out, so more people are negligent in their salah. Then he gives another example. He says, and if a sheikh were to walk in on a gathering and sit down wearing gold, very flashy sheikh, and silk, the people would get so offended, they would be repulsed by him, disgusted, openly, sitting like this, they throw him out the window, right? He said, but if this sheikh were to speak from the beginning of the gathering to its end about people's honor and slander them and backbite them and gossip about them, nobody would bat an eye. He said, why is that? It's not because of the Sharia, because backbiting is way worse in Allah's revealed morality than wearing gold and silk for a man. They're both enormities, but this is a way worse enormity. So then why? Why does this one get a reaction, that one doesn't? Because this one is not very precedented. You don't really see this happening. Gold and silk for a man of, that represents the deen. Whereas backbiting, even among the scholarly class, is relatively more prevalent and prominent. So that's exposure, right? You watch where you go. Don't go there. And if you find yourself there, walk away from there. It will impact you. And Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best. We thank Allah for permitting for us to go through whatever we went through. I pray it was of benefit for some of you. Take from it what you can and rehearse from it. The translation should be printed soon, inshallah. IIPH has, alhamdulillah, my translation of the book, and it should put it out soon for your, paced review of it, inshallah. And inshallah, you keep it as a mainstay of your libraries at home. May Allah Azza wa Jal forgive us for what we have erred regarding him or his Messenger sallallahu or the deen, or misrepresented the author in any way. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.